Picture yourself stepping into one of the most opulent palaces ever constructed. Walls gleaming with gold leaf, chandeliers that sparkle like constellations, and swaths of silk so vast they could clothe an empire. But take a deep breath, and you're hit with a stench so fierce it could wither a bouquet from across the room. Welcome to the Palace of Versailles in the 17th century, a place where extravagance masked decay, and behind the glittering facade, royal women lived in a world of filth. No matter how adorned in jewels or dressed in satin, they were prisoners of a hygiene nightmare few could imagine. Today, we're diving deep, metaphorically, thank goodness, into the disturbingly unclean lives of France's aristocratic women during the golden age of royal power. These are the 5 most revolting hygiene habits practiced by the noblewomen of the French court. And believe me, you're not prepared for what's ahead. But before we wade into this powdered, perfumed mess, take a moment to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing where you're watching from. It's wild to think that across centuries and continents, we're united by a fascination with the hidden price of power and the women who paid it. If you were born into nobility in 17th century France, your life was built on grace, charm, and impeccable style. But when it came to cleanliness, that's where things went terribly wrong. Because in those days, bathing, something we now consider essential, was thought to be dangerous. Contemporary medicine warned that warm water opened the pores, letting in invisible diseases that drifted through the air. And the church only reinforced the fear, condemning public bathhouses as dens of sin and vanity. The result? A society that slowly turned its back on water. Royal women didn't have access to private baths, steaming showers, or scented soaps. In fact, most avoided full-body washing altogether. It was considered unnecessary, or worse, immoral. Instead, noblewomen would gently dab their faces, hands, and necks with cloths barely moistened, not with water, but with vinegar, alcohol, or even saliva. Anything to avoid opening the pores. And on the rare occasion that a bath did happen, it was usually a communal event. Families shared the same tub, one after the other. Men, of course, went first. By the time a woman lowered herself into the water, it was tepid, cloudy, and filled with everything the others left behind, assuming there was even enough left to soak in. The smell of Versailles was legendary, and not in a good way. It wasn't just the stables that reeked. Visitors often remarked on the suffocating odor that drifted through the palace halls, a nauseating blend of stale perfume, sweat, mildew, and animal grease. The court wasn't indifferent to appearances, far from it. But their definition of cleanliness was something else entirely. Women at Versailles were expected to embody elegance. Their faces were dusted in fine powder, their gowns flawless, their jewels catching every flicker of candlelight. But beneath the surface, skin that hadn't felt soap in months. From afar, they were visions of refinement. Up close, a different story entirely. And as if that contradiction weren't enough, we arrive at the next hygiene nightmare, one we now take completely for granted: toilets. Versailles might have been a masterpiece of architecture, a glittering symbol of royal grandeur, but it had almost no functioning bathrooms. Despite boasting hundreds of rooms and thousands of residents, working toilets were virtually non-existent. The solution? Chamber pots, ceramic bowls tucked discreetly under beds, behind tapestries, or in corners of rooms. When nature called, the pot was the answer. Once full, it was up to a servant to dispose of it, if you were lucky. Otherwise, its contents were hurled straight out the nearest window. If the wind wasn't on your side, or the courtyard below was busy, unlucky passers-by might find themselves on the receiving end of a very unpleasant surprise. And some aristocrats didn't even bother with pots. Men were often seen urinating from balconies or relieving themselves in the palace gardens. For foreign dignitaries, it was appalling, and it happened regularly. Versailles became infamous not just for its splendor, but for its overwhelming stench. Hallways reeked, often doubling as improvised latrines. Picture a noblewoman drifting through those marble corridors in an embroidered silk gown, not lifting her skirts in grace, but to dodge piles of human waste. Things got so out of hand that by 1715, the monarchy had to issue a formal order. Palace floors must be cleaned once a week. That was considered an upgrade. Let's not forget the matter of wiping, or more accurately, the lack of it. Toilet paper hadn't been invented. People made do with what they could. Torn rags, handfuls of hay, bits of leaves, or, in moments of desperation, bare hands. And proper hand washing? Practically unheard of. With waste tossed from windows and hygiene based on guesswork, disease and parasites spread like wildfire. Yet somehow, in the midst of this filth, fashion flourished. Nowhere was this more evident than in the towering hairstyles of noblewomen. These weren't just hairdos, they were structural feats, enormous constructions that rose high above the head, adorned with lace, pearls, imitation flowers, tiny gardens, even miniature ships, sailing through powdered waves of curls. To build and secure these ornate styles, women used metal frames, horsehair, cotton stuffing, and most crucially, pomade made from beef fat. It held the style firmly in place, but also created a sticky, inviting habitat for lice. Since wigs were rarely removed and washing was uncommon, lice infestations weren't a possibility. They were a given. Entire colonies of lice thrived beneath those hairstyles. To cope, women carried decorative tools, long silver lice claws, that allowed them to discreetly scratch their scalps. It was perfectly normal for a lady to pause mid-dinner, raise a gloved hand to her head, and deliver a subtle scratch before sipping her wine. No matter how badly your scalp itched or how foul the smell of beef fat pomade became, skipping out on the fashion parade at Versailles was unthinkable. Appearance was everything. Your hairstyle wasn't just vanity, it was your social armor. To show up underdressed or worse, out of fashion, was to risk instant exclusion. So even if your wig had become a writhing ecosystem of pests, it stayed firmly on. The spectacle had to go on. But those towering wigs weren't just uncomfortable, they were outright hazardous. Some were so massive they caused chronic neck and back strain. Others brushed too close to open flames and burst into fire. Still, noblewomen wore them with pride. It was simply the tax they paid for privilege and visibility. By contrast, peasant women sidestepped the drama entirely. They shaved their heads to escape the lice and the weight, both literal and social. For the aristocracy, however, their elaborate coiffure was a crown in its own right. Even if that crown was secretly a greasy, vermin-infested mess hidden beneath powdered ribbons and silk flowers. Now, let's turn to something that should have offered comfort, but didn't. Food. Versailles was famous for its lavish banquets. Tables groaned under the abundance: roasted pheasants, steaming meat pies, candied fruits, pastries glazed in gold leaf. But behind the shimmering dishes was a grotesque reality. The palace kitchens were as unhygienic as the rest of Versailles, perhaps even worse. The plumbing was so appallingly inadequate that sewage sometimes backed up into cooking areas. On at least one occasion, filthy wastewater seeped into Queen Marie Antoinette's private kitchen. The results were disastrous. With no refrigeration, no proper ventilation, and no systematic waste disposal, food safety was a lost cause. Meat turned quickly. Produce rotted on countertops. Rats and insects scurried openly through pantries. And yet the kitchen staff had no choice. Meals still had to be prepared and served, regardless of how spoiled the ingredients had become. The price? A long list of horrors: vomiting, diarrhea, foodborne illness, all routine. But even worse were the parasites. Tapeworms and other intestinal invaders plagued the nobility, passed on through undercooked meats and filthy conditions. Not even King Louis XIV was immune. Records suggest he once expelled a 6-inch-long tapeworm. His royal title meant nothing to the germs thriving in his palace. Despite the risks, meals at Versailles were performances in themselves, especially for women. They were expected to dine gracefully, to flirt, to charm, even while battling stomach pain, nausea, or worse. They smiled through it all, sacrificing their comfort for the illusion of refinement. And now we arrive at the most private and most harrowing experience in a noblewoman's life: childbirth. For women of the court, labor wasn't just painful, it was public theater. In 17th century France, when a queen or high-ranking noblewoman went into labor, it wasn't a personal event, it was a state occasion. The birthing room filled with courtiers, clergymen, physicians, and high-born spectators. Not to assist, not to comfort, but to watch. When Queen Marie-Thérèse went into labor, her chamber didn't resemble a sanctuary. It looked more like a stage. The room was packed wall to wall with courtiers, clergy, physicians, and aristocrats. But they weren't there to assist. They were there to witness. Why? Because rumor was a powerful force. Fears of baby swapping, replacing a stillborn or female infant with a healthy male heir, led to a disturbing solution. Make the birth a spectacle. Eliminate secrecy through surveillance. So the queen, like every noblewoman before and after her, gave birth under the weight of 1,000 stares. She endured excruciating pain, with no privacy, no comfort, and certainly no dignity. Marie Antoinette herself famously fainted after delivering her child, overwhelmed by the heat, the suffocating crowd, and the crushing pressure of it all. And she wasn't alone. Countless women collapsed, screamed, or suffered silently, while their agony unfolded in full public view. And childbirth in the 17th century? It was perilous. With almost no understanding of infection, no antiseptics, no painkillers, and no concept of hygiene, every delivery was a gamble. 1 in 3 children wouldn't survive to see their 3rd birthday. Countless mothers died from sepsis, blood loss, or crude surgical interventions performed with unwashed hands and blunted tools. So while a royal birth might have symbolized hope for a nation, for the woman in labor, it was a moment of terror, vulnerability, and often trauma. The psychological burden was immense and rarely acknowledged. And there you have it, 5 unsettling realities hidden behind the polished facade of Versailles. Beneath the gold-gilded walls, beneath the mountain of silk gowns and layers of glittering jewels, the women of the French court endured lives of discomfort, indignity, and quiet suffering. They smiled in salons, posed in portraits, dazzled in drawing rooms, but behind closed doors, they itched, gagged, bled, and persevered. Their stories were not meant to be remembered, but they should be. So if you ever imagined royal life was all velvet ballrooms and crystal chandeliers, think again. The truth? Far grittier, far more human. Until next time, keep digging through the dirt of the past, because history isn't always elegant. Sometimes it stinks.